According to a War and Peace article, there have been an estimated of 250 major wars since the end of World War II. War is a scary and dangerous thing. All of us here value family, and I'm sure we want to keep them as safe as possible. That's where the United Nations peacekeeping operations come into play. After doing extensive research on the United Nations peacekeeping operations, I have a strong understanding of what it is and what it does. That is why I believe that the U.S. federal government should establish a policy increasing its support of the United Nations peacekeeping operations. I came to this conclusion by identifying these three things. First, what is the United Nations peacekeeping operations? 2, the benefits of supporting the operations, and lastly, ways the government can support the operations. To begin, we first must know what the United Nations peacekeeping operations is. According to the United Nations peacekeeping website, UN operations are composed of nations whose goal it is to help other countries maintain or establish peace. The operations rely heavily on the principles of consent of parties, impartiality, and the non-use of force except in self-defense and defense of a mandate. So, the first is consent. They need consent or acceptance of the parties involved, or they run the risk of becoming part of the conflict, and that's the exact opposite of what they want to do. They also have impartiality, which is important to the operations because it gains cooperation and credibility, and credibility is very important to the operations. It also does not use force unless in a self-defense situation, or if it has consent of the host nation or the main parties, and it also has to be approved by the Security Council to use force. The United Nations peacekeeping operations does many things to maintain peace and security throughout the world. One of the things it does is it has conflict prevention, and that is the recognition of early signs and preventing tension from turning into conflict. It also has peacemaking, and that is when conflict is addressed and an effort is made to get parties to negotiate. Peace enforcement may need more extreme measures than other tactics. This is when they would use military force, and again, they have to be approved by the Security Council. Lastly, they use peace building, and that is reducing the risk of relapsing or lapsing and creating conditions for lasting peace, which is the ultimate goal. The United Nations peacekeeping operations principles and guidelines states that the operations were formed in 1948, so it's been around for a while. The Charter of the United Nations is the foundation of the whole operations, and that was signed June 26, 1945, so they had a time period in there where they got everything together. There have been 60 operations conducted, and there are currently 16 in action. The operations relate everything that they do to the idea of human rights, and that everyone has human rights, and that's where the whole foundation is from. Georgi Pilotiv's site shows that there are advantages and disadvantages that come with the UN operations. However, many of the disadvantages come from the lack of supplies and personnel that they need. Since it does not have all the tools that it needs, the outcomes may not be as successful as what they hope for. There is also not a standby army at the ready, and some of the procedures may be too long for the time limits. There's a critical area in there, and since the procedures may be too long, they may miss an opportunity that they may have in that area. And also, because of its rules, it may not be able to carry out all the missions that it sets out to do. Even with these disadvantages, though, I believe that the pros outweigh the cons. To start, the UN peacekeeping operations is a reliable and unbiased source in the peace process. The operations can also reach any place in the world because many of the nations compose it, so they are able to spread out across the world. Experts help with the training, so they're able to do many things and do things well. Lastly, nations share their payments and give voluntary contributions. The nations' payments are determined by different factors, determining their economic status and how big they are, and the United States does lead in that. With all the positive things that the UN peacekeeping operation does, the United States should continue to support it and even increase its support. Enhancing U.S. support for UN peacekeeping, written by Nancy Soderberg, suggests that one way to continue support is to use the United States. The operations has a hard time getting things that they request because it's so scattered around. But if the United Nations or the United States ask for the items needed, it is more likely to be received because we have more power than some of the other nations. The U.S. can also increase support by increasing its involvement. Money is not the only way to contribute, and even though we are leading that, we can get involved in other ways. And one way is by providing more personnel. The U.S. currently only has 85 individuals provided. By increasing our support, we will be able to help them. Everyone needs help sometime in their life, and now is the time for the United Nations peacekeeping operations. Knowing what the UN peacekeeping operations is, and knowing the benefits it brings, we can now make a plan to support it. It has been in action for over 60 years and will continue for many more years, but only with the help of the United States. The U.S. federal government should establish a policy that would increase its support for their operations by requesting needed items or increasing personnel involved. By supporting the United Nations peacekeeping operations, hopefully there will be less war and more peace in the future.